The Assyrians are one of the oldest civilizations in the Middle East and one of the civilizations that lasted the longest. Their origins go all the way back to the first Amorite incursions into Mesopotamia. This is probably around the year 2000 BC. We also know that the area where the Assyrians first developed was already inhabited by people who had already developed the basics of civilization. Traditionally, the founder of the Assyrian kingdom is considered Shamshi Adad. He Shamshi Adad the first, because there were several kings with this name. And Shamshi Adad was an Amorite lord who apparently was expelled or was forced out of Babylon. If you remember, the kingdom of Babylon was founded by the Amorites. Hammurabi was an Amorite, for example. So around 1813 BC, Shamshi-Adad moved north, and we assume that he may have moved north with an entourage, with a group of people, and he settled in an area that was already inhabited and already had uh, all the trappings of civilization. And he took a city by the name of Ashur as his main base. Out of this city of Ashur, and here you see the ruins of this ancient city, Shamshadad uh, started to expand and to solidify a kingdom. So the initial kingdom of Ashur is basically created by an Amorite lord who has traveled to this place, has taken control of that, and now he begins to consolidate his power. The term Ashur comes from one of the gods of the Amorites, and in this case, he becomes the main god of the people who take his name, Assyrians. So the term Assyrian comes from both Ashur, the city, and Ashur, the god. The city was named after the god. So the Assyrians are the people of Ashur. Of course, they also believed in many other gods, but this was their tribal god, the god that gave them their tribal identity, and therefore he was also their warrior god. And if you look at this image, we see one of the Assyrian kings next to the something called the Tree of Life, which is an important religious concept in Semitic religion and mythology. And above the tree, you will see that there is a figure with wings, and that is the god Ashur. The old Assyrian kingdom developed as an important political entity in the northern part of Mesopotamia. By the year 1400, however, it had come under the rule of Mitanni. If you recall, the Mitannians were the kingdom created by the Hurrians, one of the Hurrian kingdoms created in the Middle East, and by 1400 they had become quite prominent. And you can see here the whole purple and light purple area is the area controlled by them, including the city of Ashur and its surroundings. The Middle Assyrian Empire begins in 1392 when the Assyrians expel the people, the Mitannian rulers, and they recover their independence. And as you can see, it's a long-lived kingdom. It lasts from 1392 to 934 BC. And during that time, it expands mainly towards the north and the west. As it expands, it also develops a policy of bringing Assyrian families and planting them as colonists in the newly conquered territories. Another institution that developed during the Middle Assyrian Empire is something known as Ilku service, and there is a lot of debate as to what this actually consisted of, but we know that one aspect of the Ilku service was to grant land to a warrior who was a charioteer in exchange for military service. So these charioteers were able to have a steady source of income through their land, We don't know whether they actually work on the land or they had people working for them, but as uh, payment for the land, they had to provide military service. So it's a military tax, if you wish. Of course, the charioteers were the elite of the Assyrian army. If you remember, chariots were introduced by Indo-Europeans, the Hurrians, and later the Hittites into the Middle East. But as soon as this technology arrived in the Middle East, it was spread to all the Semites and other groups of people who lived there. So the Assyrians adopted the domestication of the horse and the use of the chariot quite early and formed this type of ilku service. Some historians are still debating as to whether the ilku service also applied to other elements within the army, but we are not sure. However, this concept of the ilku service will be very important to explain how later on the Neo-Assyrian Empire is able to become so successful. If you recall, around the year 1200 BC, the Sea Peoples appear on the horizon. And the incursions of the Sea Peoples and the crisis that they created eventually led to the withdrawal of Egypt from the area of Syria, Palestine, and eventually the collapse of um, the Hittite Empire in Anatolia, Asia Minor, what today would be Turkey. So from 1200 to around the year 1000 BC, we have a critical period throughout the Eastern Mediterranean where the great civilizations collapse under the pressure of not only the Sea Peoples but other groups that came after them. Many of these states that had reached great heights collapsed or declined. There was, for example, in Greece, virtually every single city was burned during this period. The Minoan civilization in Crete collapsed, disappeared, and to this day is kind of a mystery to us. So the disruption of the crisis of the first millennium was extremely uh, strong in this whole area. And the Assyrians were not an exception to suffering from them. So the Middle Assyrian Empire collapsed, but the Assyrians were still there. And this is something about the Assyrians, that they are resilient. They appear first in history around 1900, 1800 BC, and they go through a roller coaster in terms of their political situation. They become strong, they come under the control of another empire, they become independent once again, they grow, and then they contract. It is a very interesting history, and by the year 911, the Assyrians had been around for around 1,000 years. During that period, many empires simply disappeared, never to reappear, but not the Assyrians. And around 911 BC, there is a rebirth of this empire, and this empire we call the Neo-Assyrian Empire. Neo means new. Under King Ashur-nasiripal II, I know a very long name, uh, the Neo-Assyrian Empire started to expand systematically, and you can see in this map how during his reign, the campaigns are going to go down along the valleys of the Tigris and Euphrates River into Mesopotamia, into the area where Babylon is located. His armies are going to go up north and east and west, into Anatolia, what today is modern day Turkey, and his armies will go down along the coast of Syria, Palestine. During this time, there will be a systematic effort to acquire territory. And it seems that at this point, the Assyrians have adopted a preemptive strike policy. Conquest becomes a way of life. And very often we hear that as the Neo-Assyrian Empire was a militarized society, because it seems that every effort, every resource that was concentrated in this kingdom was utilized towards the war effort. War becomes the reason of being of this kingdom. Expansion and war. And this is the idea. If you are surrounded by other states, at one point some of them will be a threat to you. So rather than wait until that happens, let's attack them first. That's what a preemptive strike is. And it seems that this is what Ashurnasirpal and his successors will be doing. Like clockwork, every year the armies are mustered and they march with a specific target. And they will be quite successful. Now, something that is different about this period and something that is different about the Assyrians is that they are able to muster extremely large armies. If you recall, the Battle of Kadesh, 1277, which confronted Ramses II, the king of Egypt, with Muwatallis, the king of the Hittites. That was probably the largest battle in history at that point in terms of the number of men. It is believed that there may have been about 20,000 men on each side. And that's pretty significant. But during the Neo-Assyrian Empire, we start to see armies of 40, 50, 60, 90, 120,000 soldiers marching into an enemy territory on a single campaign. And this is extraordinary. The reason why battles prior to this point could not be bigger than about 20,000, and that was a stretch. The reason why battles could not be bigger than that is because, remember, in these societies, at least 80% of the population was dedicated to farming. The rest were dedicated to the manufacture of certain goods like weapons, tools, pottery, etc., construction. So that means that the number of men that could be engaged in war was quite limited. So there was a natural demographic limit to how big armies could be. And no one could crack the code as to how to make these armies bigger. And of course, we know that all the way back to the Sumerians, in order to supplement their forces, what the Sumerians did was to hire mercenaries, people from the outside. And that continued throughout this historical period, but never to the point of being able to field 100,000 or more people on a single campaign. And the Assyrians were able to do that. So we're going to look at some of the innovations that took place under the Assyrians to understand their success. In this image to the left, this is from a relief. A relief is a sculpture on a panel on a wall panel that could depict anything. And the Assyrians are famous for their high relief and low relief. These are different types of sculptures that you do on a big panel of rock or wall. And in these reliefs, the Assyrian kings provide depictions of their accomplishments in war. This panel on the left shows three men shooting arrows against, and you can see on the left, a wall from a city that is also being defended by archers. If you look on the top left side, you will see that there's someone with a bow and arrow shooting down at the three fellows in front. But if you look close to them, only two of them have bow and arrows. There's a third one in the middle, and what he's doing is he's holding a shield. He is a shield bearer. Now think about this. How much skill do you need to be a decent archer? Probably you have to work from an early age. You have to train a lot. Or even if you pick up the weapon later in life, you have to train constantly to be effective as an archer. It's not easy to shoot a compound bow, and it is very difficult to be accurate doing it. How much skill do you need to hold a shield? Well, you have to get some training. You have to know how to cover your fellows well, and you have to also become acclimated to combat. It must be a scary thing to be holding a shield while people from a wall are shooting arrows at you. But the amount of training that is required for that is not the same as that is required for an archer. On the next panel, what you see is a mounted archer. Uh, Cavalry, up until that point, was used only as part of the chariot corps. Horses hauled chariots into battle. Horses had to be bred to be strong enough to carry a man while galloping. And the Assyrians, well, actually, the Hurrians started to develop a lot of techniques to breed horses, but by the time the Neo-Assyrians are in power, they are breeding horses that are able to be ridden. And some of the horsemen were lancers, that is, they had lances or spears as they fought, but many of these people were archers. You have to keep in mind that in ancient times, the saddles of the horses did not have stirrups. Stirrups are the two hoops hanging from the saddle, and they give you stability. Well, that didn't exist. That came until much, much later in history. So think about how difficult it would have been for you to be riding a horse without stirrups, and on top of that, you now have a bow, you take out an arrow, and you have to shoot an arrow accurately while someone else is trying to shoot at you. It's incredibly difficult, but the Assyrians were able to develop a very efficient cavalry in that way. And how did they do it? Well, sometimes they would have a pair of riders. One was holding the reins of the two horses, and the other was shooting the bow and arrow. There is actually, I have seen a panel where there are actually three riders. There are two with bow and arrows. There are two archers on the sides, and then there is a fellow in the middle on horse holding the reins of the three horses. So he is basically providing the stability for the horses and allowing the other ones to freely pick and choose their targets. What does that tell you about the Assyrians? Well, the Assyrians discovered that in order to be efficient in battle, you don't have to have a warrior who can ride a horse, shoot an arrow, use a spear, use a sword, use an axe. No. What you need is to have someone who is good at one specific task. Some tasks require more training than the others. The Assyrians were geniuses from the military standpoint in that they were able to break down warfare into specific tasks that could be performed by different people with different levels of training. Like that fellow holding the shield. That's extremely important. Why? Because that means that you no longer have to train a warrior from the time that he's 5. That means that you can actually employ peasants as soldiers, at least for a limited period of time. And that's the key to have these gigantic armies. Now let's take a look at some of the other elements that were part of the Assyrian army. In this slide, on the left, you can see a chariot. Chariots were very important. Now, this particular one shows one person, a king, riding a chariot. War chariots were actually a little bigger. Usually they had 2 horses, and they had 3 people in them. One was the driver, who held the reins of the horse. The second one was a fellow who either had bow and arrow to shoot arrows at the enemy, or javelins. A javelin is like a spear, but it's small and short and light, so you can throw it at the enemy and it's lethal. The third fellow was a shield bearer, a fellow who, with his shield, was protecting both the driver and the missile thrower, right? A missile is anything that you throw out. So he was either shooting arrows or throwing javelins. So the third fellow, has a shield protecting the other 2. Quite clever. Then on the right, you have slingers. Slingshots were a very, very efficient and lethal weapon throughout antiquity. Basically, you take a strap of leather, has 2 hoops, you hold it with your a hoop with a different finger, you swing the sling with a piece, sometimes of rock, but actually in some cases they had a piece of flat metal. with an edge, very heavy and a little aerodynamic, and they would sling that against an enemy. That thing would definitely break through the cranium of the enemy. We know that it could sometimes even break through a helmet. So slingshots were extremely able, and the thing about the slingshot is that he is able to shoot many of these rocks or these projectiles in rapid succession. And here we see the infantry. Infantry was the backbone of the army. As you can see, they have uniforms, they have the same equipment. So it is the first time that we see people with really standardized equipment. They have spears and shields. We know that in this case, the shields are rectangular, but we know that they had round shields, almost like in the shape of a cone. The infantry also used axes, battle axes, and for the first time, we start to see significant use of swords among the Semites in this part of the world. The infantry very often launches attacks together against the enemy. These are frontal attacks. And while the infantry attacks, you will have the cavalry attacking on the sides. There's also something else. They have mounted infantry. And this is an interesting concept. These were basically people who are on horse, and during the battle, they move to different parts of the battle on horse. But once they encounter the enemy, they dismount and they fight on foot. It's pretty strange, but actually it happened a lot in history, mounted infantry. And then on the right, we have an interesting scene. It's hard to make out, but if you see, there are a couple of people who look like swimming, and they have something, they're hugging something. These are actually skins, most likely goat skins. They were inflatable. So they used these goat skins to cross rivers. And of course, if you look at a map of Mesopotamia, it's filled with rivers and swamps. The other part of this scene is actually a barge where they are carrying a chariot across. The people doing this are called sappers. A sapper is an army engineer. Sappers are people who build bridges, who dig holes, the ones who pull equipment up a mountain. They build the defenses of the camp. They are really essential. And in the Assyrian army, they have a huge number of people whose task is to build stuff, to build equipment, to build fortifications, or to build machines that will enable them to take cities. Now, when you look at this whole image, all of these things, you can see how this army requires a tremendous amount of organization. And what we think happened here was that the Assyrians found a system that enabled them to make use of a significantly larger part of the Assyrian population through the Ilku system. You remember the Ilku system from the Middle Assyrian Kingdom was you provide military service in exchange for land. It seems that this was extended now through to basically all the ranks of the army. So if you are a peasant, you are granted a piece of land. And then for 5 years, you work on your land, producing grain, paying taxes, being an important element of the economic life of Assyrian society. And then the next 2 years, you serve in the army. After you come back from the army, you work again in your farm for 5 years, and then after that, you go back to serve 2 years. And you do that for the rest of your life. So you get killed, of course, you cannot continue, or if you get to be old. And this is very important because that means that these Assyrian soldiers have a real incentive to fight. They are not mercenaries, they are not conscripted soldiers who are fighting for something they don't like. No, they are men who have been given land, which is incredibly important for anyone at any point in history. To own land is the dream of every person. So these men have land. They are now part of a victorious army, and who doesn't want to be part of a victorious army? And as part of the victorious army, you capture loot, you capture treasure. When you capture a city and the city is ransacked, you get a share of that, and you get to be part of an elite group of soldiers, which is very important too. So it is believed that through this system, the Assyrians are able to create a very, very large army. But that's not enough because remember, one thing is to recruit the men, another thing is to train them, to equip them, to transport them. So the Assyrians were perhaps the greatest at logistics of any armies in ancient times prior to, I would say, prior to Alexander and prior to the Romans. The logistics is the ability to manage and channel your resources towards a goal. So logistics means organization. How do you organize your resources? Whatever your goal is, right? So for example, a great example of logistics today is Amazon. You think about what you want, and in 2 hours, someone is ringing your bell, and there you have it, right? Amazon is really the epitome of efficiency in terms of logistics. You order the thing, they know where it's located, they get that to a point of transportation, and then within hours sometimes, right, at the most a couple of days, you have it in your house. When it comes to the military, logistics is the ability to organize your resources towards the aims of war. And the Assyrians are incredible at that. So they have the ability to produce weapons massively because they have so many soldiers. They have the ability to feed these soldiers and train them. And we know that they actually built huge depots of weapons and equipment and food along different strategic roads or routes. So if I have to transport 10,000 or 20,000 soldiers from point A to point B, all they have to do is have enough food for 2 or 3 days with them. That means that they can travel light and they can travel fast. And after 2 or 3 days, they find one of these huge depots where they will be provided with whatever they need at that point. The fast mobilization of troops is key to success in battle, and the Assyrians mastered that. Of course, the only way to do that is if you have a bureaucracy that is very efficient behind you. What's a bureaucracy? A bureaucracy is an institution of administrators, the people who collect taxes, the people who have who hold a census so they know how many people live in the land, how much tax each one owes, what is the age or the gender of a household. If you have all of that information, then you can plan. You can go to a village and you know that you cannot ask all the men to go to war at the same time. There is a record, there's an administrator who knows who goes when. So you take 20 men this year and they go to the army for 2 years. Next year, you take another 20, and by the third year, the ones who went out the third year are coming back to the village. So you keep a balance between having enough manpower to produce food in the villages and the farms, and you have enough manpower for the army. This you can only accomplish if you have bureaucrats, administrators, people who know how to keep and write and who are very good at managing, at organizing records, written records. Of course, the true test of an army is when it goes to battle. And the Assyrians had to go to battle often, and they had to go to battle against enemies who had fortified cities, cities with tall walls and towers and archers defending them. If you want to take a fortified city, what do? Well, you bring a big army, 20, 30,000 men, and you surround the city, and you hope that the people inside the city become thirsty, they starve, they become afflicted by disease, or they just become psychologically frail and they surrender. Of course, that can last a long time, And a lot of these cities are prepared. So they have a water source inside the city.